Thank you for the opportunity to speak. Very interesting presentations. All speakers spoke about the need for resources, and in particular Mr. Jenny mentioned that we couldn't have a one-size-fits-all situation. I'm just wondering, for a country like the Republic of Ireland, where I come from, with 4.565 million residents, would any of the speakers let me know, do they believe that 2 members of the police force for the whole country would be enough? And would that, okay, you say it isn't one size fits all, but do you think because we have serious concerns in our country about enforcement of competition law? In fact, as far back as 2005, the current Agriculture Commissioner, Phil Hogan, expressed his concerns about Irish competition law in our Parliament. And speech was made on November the 15th, 2005. I suggest you read it or have a look at it, or maybe talk to Mr. Hogan about it, because the situation hasn't changed. It is estimated that lack of enforcement costs the Irish economy €4 billion every year, or €2,400 per household. So the question I have is, do you believe that 2 members of the police force is enough for a population of over 4.5 million? And also, on the issue of private enforcement, in the Republic of Ireland, civil cases on competition are impossible. People who have been affected by cartels have been trying to change this law for over 20 years. In fact, one such person has been trying to get a court case going for the last 20 years. But because of the burden of proof, because it has to be done through criminal law, he finds it impossible, and it is affecting the Irish economy. I understand that in other EU states that civil cases are very possible. I'm just wondering, could someone from the panel comment on the fact that you can't do that in Ireland, and is this sustainable and should it be allowed to continue? Thank you very much.
Very good. So, Professor Jenny.
There were many questions, some of which are very difficult for me to answer, in particular the one on the Irish Competition Authority. What I want to point out is the reason why it's very difficult to have a standard is because the functioning, the type of competition authority, whether they are administrative authority, or we are an administrative model or prosecutorial model, whether the authority has several functions or is a single function authority, whether we have administrative or criminal proceedings, makes an enormous amount of difference. So that's why I said that there is no norm. Now, that doesn't mean to say that the situation is satisfactory in each country, but I think that it is for each country to decide on what it wants to do. Certainly, having criminal sanction increases the cost of systems for all kinds of reasons, because, as it was said, the standard of proof is much higher, and also because the rapidity of the system is not as great as in administrative systems.
Final round of interventions from the panelists. Mrs. Fernandez for 3 minutes, please.
I absolutely believe that it is needed as well to grant the national competition authorities a standard, local standard, to be able to challenge in court all those legislations, regulations that are incompatible with competition rules, with EU competition rules, because that's the warranty that we will be gaining more and more a framework that would be compatible all over Europe. So we will have advocates of the competition enforcement and on also the legislative process.
Now, next speaker is Isolde Godgen. Was appointed member of the Irish Competition Authority in August 2010, and she's director of the Advocacy Division. Please.
Thank you, Chairman. Ireland, as a small open economy, regards competition perhaps as more crucial even than many other countries within the European project. It's absolutely vital to our success as an exporting nation. When effectively enforced, it keeps access to markets open. It creates innovation so that new companies can enter and prosper, and established companies can continue to develop and to innovate. And it protects both consumers and companies from anti-competitive behaviour, either by a single dominant company or by a group of companies illegally colluding. Because it spans the entire economy and because it covers all companies, large and small, I believe that it needs an appropriate range of sanctions tailored to the type of behaviour that's being investigated. And because hardcore cartels are considered the most serious form of anti-competitive conduct, constituting deliberate behaviour aimed at damaging consumer welfare, I believe that criminal sanctions are entirely appropriate for this. These can range from imprisonment through fines on individuals and companies to director disqualification. Ireland has a strong track record in successfully prosecuting cartels, including the first jury conviction for price fixing in Europe, and to date 33 individuals and companies have been convicted of price fixing and fined. Although jail sentences have been imposed, these have always been suspended. A peculiarity of the system, though, is that these penalties can only be imposed after a criminal prosecution. So the offence must be proved to the criminal standard, which is beyond reasonable doubt. This has benefits for the type of hardcore cartel offence I've talked about. It means that everything is dragged into the light of day for the jury to see. The trials are conducted in public. People really get an insight into the kind of meanness and anti-consumer viewpoint that underlies these kind of very serious offences. However, the system just isn't appropriate to some other types of offences, particularly to the abuse of dominance or vertical agreements like distribution agreements. In these cases, they tend to rely on economic argument. You have economic expert witnesses. It's really not suitable to a jury where there just arises a huge possibility and tendency for confusion, and they're expected to make judgments on very, very complicated economic issues. So the balance of probability standard, the civil standard of proof is more appropriate to that type of offence. But unlike in most other European jurisdictions, civil courts in Ireland cannot impose penalties. They can't impose fines and undertakings. So the most that we can achieve through taking cases to the civil courts is a declaration that the conduct is illegal and an injunction to prevent the undertaking from continuing it. We don't ourselves have the power to adopt prohibition decisions or to make orders, grant remedies or impose penalties. Those matters are all reserved for the courts. We have been vigorous in using the powers that we have. So, for instance, taking court proceedings against trade undertakings or trade associations for fixing prices or seeking injunctions to prevent collective boycotts. There are definitely cases where we would have sought fines if that had been possible in our system. So the lack of any kind of penalty means that you don't really have the deterrent effect that you could have in such cases, not just in relation to that particular company or group of companies, but also in relation to others, because, you know, industry, you don't get the publicity that you would get if fines are being imposed, and, you know, there may well be an attitude that industry may as well engage in this kind of conduct, because even if they're caught, they're not at a loss. All they have to do is stop it. So you don't get the learning across the wider economy. We would regard it as crucial that we and other competition authorities across Europe should have access to the full range of sanctions, both criminal and civil. Otherwise, enforcement is unduly biased towards certain types of conduct. You have competition developing unevenly across different sectors and markets, and the welfare of consumers, not just in Ireland but in Europe as a whole, will suffer. I just wanted to say one thing as well in relation to this initiative, and whether it's a centralising initiative or otherwise. We have found that the network of European competition authorities, the ECN, works hugely well for us, but I think also for other countries as well. And it is really a network, it is really a sharing between the Commission and the competition authorities of the Member States. We learn from each other, we tell each other what goes on, we share not just facts but information, how to do things, best practice, and it's been hugely beneficial for us. My organisation, the Competition and Consumer Protection Commission, also has responsibilities in consumer protection and in product safety, and I wish we had the equivalent of the network that we have in the competition area. I wish we had that kind of learning and sharing with other authorities in those areas as well. Thank you, Chairman.
In the case of Ireland, and the chairperson of the Irish Competition and Consumer Protection Commission spoke about the sanctions that could apply, and I was interested for her observations, particularly when it came to high-profile cases that the authority has taken I think she mentioned that in all cases the sentences were suspended. She might clarify that. I say that because there has to be a balance struck between, at one level, taking cases which send out a very strong public message through the court system, or indeed through authorities, that this kind of malpractice and unfair dominant position would have to be challenged. And of course, bad behaviour is only ever changed and altered by way of sanction. The question is, are the sanctions we have in place sufficient and appropriate? And ultimately, will it take people to go to prison, ultimately, in terms of sending out that message? And I think that is an important issue that needs to be highlighted. Notwithstanding that, I certainly want to put on record my appreciation to the work of the Irish Competition Authority in this area and others, and to say what we need to do further is to work closer in a more coordinated way with other colleagues right the way across the European Union to make sure that these dominant positions that companies are taking up are exposed and are brought to justice. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Mr. Flanagan.
Thank you very much. That was yet again very interesting. I have a question I'd like to direct to Isolde Goggins. You say that as an open economy, competition in Ireland, competition policy in Ireland is even more important. I agree, that is definite. You also say that Ireland has a strong record of imposing sanctions on cartels. I don't really see how. I'd like you to explain in more detail how, because you mentioned the 33 cases. As far as I can see, they were back as far as 2008 and 2006. And in the case of the oil companies, they were fined an average of €7,500 in 2006. Conclude that it was actually worth their while, because really, how on earth could they not have made more money out of that cartel than the €7,500 they were fined? Where is the moral hazard? The reality is it was worth their while, which means other companies will do it. In the case of the Citron case, €20,000 of a fine and no jail sentence in 2008. You wouldn't need to sell many Citrons in Ireland to make €20,000 profit. So yet again, in Citron's case, I suppose, from a business sense, it probably was worth their while. So how on earth have we a strong record imposing sanctions on cartels? Isolde, you got the job in 2011. What prosecutions have taken place? Because I constantly hear about these 33 cases being trotted out, but they're historical. So what is the deterrent? The possibility of locus standi mentioned by Mrs. Fernandez is very, very interesting. I'm wondering what would you think about that as a possibility? Because you do say that criminal law is the best way to drag issues into the light, but it's not appropriate for certain large cases, and civil courts may be more appropriate. And there is much evidence out there to suggest that that's true, so something needs to be done about it. I also think it's interesting that Brian Hayes asked the question, are the sanctions appropriate? I suggest that MEP Hayes reads his own party member, Phil Hogan, now the Commissioner for Agriculture's speech in the Irish Parliament in 2005, where he makes it quite clear it is a complete and utter joke, and nothing has changed since. So I'd like to know what you think about that, because Ireland does not have a strong record of imposing sanctions on cartels. It is a joke, not a country that imposes strong sanctions. Quite the opposite.
Mr. Godin.
Thank you, Chairman. Well, a lot of interesting points there, and I think much of what was said, I think, is very much in favour of a degree of harmonisation, be it hard or soft. Certainly, I think within the network we do try to achieve a lot of soft harmonisation, but there are certain things, such as the nature of the justice system, where soft harmonisation can only take you so far. So, for instance, in Ireland, because we have a purely criminal and prosecutorial system, we don't have a leniency programme, because we cannot impose leniency on the judiciary. The judges make the decisions. Similarly, our job is to investigate. We then refer a case to the Director of Public Prosecutions, the public official whose job it is to take cases on indictment. They decide whether to prosecute the case or not. And then, obviously, guilt or innocence is a matter for the jury, and sentencing is a matter for the judiciary. So Yeah, the level of fines are low, but that's not something that's within our control of the system. There have been prison sentences imposed, but all suspended. So, in fact, one person ended up, I think, spending a night in jail because he didn't pay the fine. So it was an imprisonment for contempt of court rather than for the original competition offence. But no, I continue to think that criminal sanctions are appropriate for certain very egregious types of behaviour. But I do feel it's important that we have a range of sanctions so that effectively the punishment can fit the crime. Thank you.